What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well formulated plant based diet. A high insulin level signals fat synthesis and storage, and a low level, its release as free fatty acid back into the circulation, observed the Harvard University metabolism and diabetes researcher George F. Cahill Jr. in 1971 in the prestigious Banting Memorial Lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association. This process is like a switch. When fat cells sense the presence of insulin in the circulation, as Cahill described it, they respond by storing fat and inhibiting its release, and we get fatter. When insulin is undetectable, we burn stored fat for fuel, and we get leaner. The metabolic state of ketosis, from which the keto diet gets its name, happens when carbohydrates are restricted almost entirely and fat provides most of the fuel for the body. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine, yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal source foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying the death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form, and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. So again, Dr. Mills, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
Well, if we were playing football, there would be so many penalty flags on the field that you could actually climb and get a look over the rim of the stadium, because that is filled with all sorts of factual and intellectual inaccuracies and non sequiturs, actually. First of all, he references a paper from 1971. And think about that. Think of the state of the world in 1971. The world we live in is, aside from the fact that we're still breathing air and wearing some type of clothing and living inside buildings, is fundamentally different from the world in 1971. And so is our knowledge base about human metabolism and the appropriate approaches to medical therapy, and the understanding of what causes and exacerbates diabetes has grown exponentially since then, and so that he's still living in 1971. I want to send him, a rotary telephone that's attached to the wall and a big gas guzzling car. I mean, it's like, come on, dude, really? First of all, he says that insulin is the hormone that governs fat metabolism. That's not true. Insulin is the hormone that governs carbohydrate metabolism. And as a result, it has an impact on fat metabolism, but its primary purpose is not to manage fat storage or synthesis. Its primary role is to help our bodies manage carbohydrate. Now, why is that? It's because unlike fat, which are these large, electrically fairly neutral molecules, carbohydrate is much more akin to gasoline. And as such, it is more reactive, and therefore the body needs to keep a much tighter regulation on how much of this rather explosive fuel is floating around our bodies, because when it starts to get to elevated levels, it causes damage. I mean, that's part of the problem with diabetes. When sugar is unregulated, those molecules start to react with all of the tissues in the body, and in very high amounts, it damages them. And it's like, again, gasoline in your car. When that gasoline is fed into the engine in a very precise and regulated fashion, your car performs like it's supposed to. Speeds up, slows down, allows you to do what you need to do. You start flooding your engine with gasoline, and you're going to end up with an engine fire, okay? And you're going to destroy your car. So likewise, carbohydrate is essential for our normal metabolism, but it has to be tightly regulated by the body. And probably one of the most obvious ways that the importance of carbohydrate is illustrated in human metabolism is the fact that the human brain normally uses only carbohydrate for its metabolism. Doesn't use fat unless it's forced to, and then it uses these things called ketone bodies. But when people are in ketosis, their brain does not work properly because it cannot function as efficiently as it normally should. And human beings have proportionately the largest brains of any terrestrial animal on this planet. And as a result, we need a lot of sugar. It's been found that human beings have 6 times the carbohydrate digesting enzymes as other primates. Well, why is that? Because our brain is so much bigger. When you compare human milk to the milk of other mammals, you see that even amongst other herbivores, human beings have proportionately more sugar in their milk relative to other species. Why is that? It's because human babies are born with these giant heads with these big brains in them. And so they need that extra carbohydrate for their brains to function properly and healthfully. And it is true that insulin levels will impact fat metabolism, excuse me. But that is a secondary effect. It's not the primary effect of insulin. And essentially the reason is as follows. If your body is suddenly flooded with a large amount of carbohydrate, the body's going to pump out insulin to bring that carbohydrate level down. Well, there are several pathways to reducing carbohydrate level. One is to store it, okay? Well, actually, let me back up. The first way is to burn it, okay? To use it for energy. The second way is to store it. And that effort to burn it off is where the sugar buzz comes from. And we've all seen it, that especially in kids, you feed them sugar, they start bouncing off the walls because their body is telling them, okay, you got all this energy, burn it up, get it out of your system, burn it up. And then, and if you want to get rid of the carbohydrate by an accelerated usage, that is burning it for fuel, well, one of the things you need to do is to stop the use of alternate fuels. So yes, when insulin levels peak and go beyond a certain point, they will signal the body, stop burning fat. We got way too much carbohydrate floating around. We got to burn up, we got to get rid of this carbohydrate first, then we'll go back to burning fat. So the problem is not carbohydrates per se, it is high insulin spikes. And what causes those high insulin spikes? It's not, again, all carbohydrates. It is processed carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates. In nature, plant foods always have their carbohydrates surrounded by indigestible fiber, because all plant cells have a wall made up of a cell wall made up of cellulose, and you have to break down and break through that cell wall to extract the carbohydrates. So that when people eat whole plant foods that have not had their fiber removed, that have not been processed in a way that makes their carbohydrate more accessible. And so, I mean, if you just, let's look at wheat berries. Wheat berries, when they're eaten whole, have a very, what's called low glycemic index, meaning that the carbohydrate from them are absorbed in a very slow fashion, so that you don't get a high insulin spike. But when you grind up that wheat, thus disrupting the fiber protection for the carbohydrate, and especially when you then go on to remove the fiber component and end up with white flour, which is essentially pure carbohydrate starch. Well, once that gets into our system, as I said, we've got 6 of these different carbohydrate digesting enzymes. We burn through that stuff like nobody's business. We can break it down and absorb it such that, because let me also say parenthetically that starch is just long chains of sugar molecules joined together, okay? And so when you break down starch, you're releasing a ton of sugar. And when that floods the system, insulin levels skyrocket. And yes, once insulin levels get beyond a certain point, that is a signal to the body, stop burning everything else, try to get rid of this carbohydrate, and that will inhibit the body from burning fat. So there are obviously 2 solutions to that. One is the idiot's solution, and that is to say, well, we're not going to eat carbohydrate, which is a necessary and important fuel source, particularly for our brains. The other is to say, well, maybe we need to stop screwing with the carbohydrates that nature made and simply eat them in their natural form. That is a whole food, whole plant food diet. Because when you eat them in that fashion, when they are intact cellular structure, when their fiber is present, you don't get a high insulin spike, and you don't have the problem of promoting fat storage, because the carbohydrates are absorbed in a very gradual fashion. They don't spike. Your sugar level remains at a within what you could say is a normal variation, and so your insulin levels actually remain very low. And when they are low, they don't promote fat storage or inhibit fat burning. And that is the much more healthful way to do this. Now, he talks about protein, as though, you know, protein is this magical food from the gods that fixes everything. Proteins are structural elements, okay? What makes protein protein is the presence of nitrogen in the amino acid molecules. And that is what our bodies use to make skin, hair, you know, and muscle tissue and all of the things we see. And that's also true for every other animal. But protein cannot be burned as protein. So, you know, people talk about, oh, well, you know, you eat these high protein diets and that's going to keep your sugar from going up. That's only because that forces the body to go through this multi-step process where it takes all of that excess protein and converts it into carbohydrate. Okay? So you're not escaping carbohydrate, you're just giving sort of a backwoods version of a low glycemic process to your absorption of carbohydrate. So instead of absorbing the carbohydrate, directly, the excess protein has to go through the liver, where it is process called deamination. The nitrogen is stripped off, the sulfur is taken out of it, and the leftover carbon backbones are then turned into carbohydrate. So you still have carbohydrate in your system. And there's a lot of problems with this process of forcing the body to convert protein into carbohydrate. It damages your kidneys, it stresses your liver, it damages your bones, and it dehydrates you. So that is not in any way an optimal way to do this. And science has confirmed this time and time again. The much better way of treating diabetes and just treating our health and metabolism in general is to eat a diet that is comprised of whole plant foods with their intact cellular structure, because then you won't get these high insulin spikes. Your body will not be prevented from burning fat. Furthermore, all of that excess fiber makes you full, keeps you from eating as much and as often. And again, study after study after study has shown that not only will you lose weight, but diabetics can actually become non-diabetic, at least type 2 diabetics. Type 1 is a different story because their bodies no longer produce insulin. But for people with type 2 diabetes, by converting to a whole food, plant-based diet, they can actually cure themselves of diabetes because their insulin metabolism is much more regulated. They become much more sensitive to the insulin that their bodies still make. And as a result, they don't need the medications or exogenous insulin to control their disease. So everything that is in that statement, and by extension that book, is just bass-ackwards screwed up nonsense. And let me also say this: now studies are showing that low-carb / keto diets promote accelerated heart disease, can put you at higher risk for cancers, and increase all-cause mortality. People are dying from these keto-style diets at much earlier ages and developing diseases in a more accelerated fashion. So I ask people all the time when I speak, I'm like, what's the point of getting on a keto diet, getting thin, and then dropping dead so that you leave a thin corpse? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.